Hi guys, tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. A place where horsepower was measured in actual horses and your morning coffee might have been replaced by a suspiciously murky mug of ale. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves, because we're stepping gently into the 18th century, a world in which being slightly tipsy wasn't a scandal. It was considered basic hydration. Now, settle yourself like a well-worn tricorn hat on a velvet cushion, and let's begin. Imagine, if you will, an English countryside in 1723. The sun winks over misty hills, the roosters are optimistically crowing, and in the village of Lower Parsnip upon Waddle, Farmer Ned shuffles out of his cottage and before bothering to button his breeches, pours himself a solid pint of beer. Not to celebrate, not to forget, just breakfast. And here's the curious thing. He wasn't alone. In towns and hamlets, manors and meadows, the good people of the 18th century were sipping, quaffing, and occasionally glugging their way through every hour of the day. Small beer with your porridge, wine with your sermon, brandy to cure what the sermon caused. The 1700s were essentially one long socially acceptable happy hour. But why, you might murmur, eyebrows rising as your eyelids slowly fall? We must first speak of water. You see, in the 1700s, water had something of a PR problem. Namely, it could kill you. Not all water, mind you. But when your main source of refreshment flowed through streets lined with waste, animal and otherwise, or trickled seductively from wells that also happened to be downhill from the public privy, there was a non-negligible chance your fresh drink came with a surprise guest named cholera, or dysentery, or a particularly peckish tapeworm. So instead, people turned to alcohol, mild, fermented, and blessed by the alchemical process of boiling. The brewing process killed most harmful bacteria, making beer, wine, and cider genuinely safer than water in many parts of Europe. Small beer, in particular, was the humble hero of the day. With an alcohol content that barely tickled the 2% mark, it was more like slightly ambitious bread juice than a party in a mug. It was brewed in great kettles, stored in wooden vats, and consumed like we now consume still or sparkling. Only theirs came in options like warm, flat, and barley-based. Even children, dignified clergy, and ladies in ruffled caps dabbled in the drink. It wasn't indulgent, it was hydration with benefits. Now, before you reimagine the entire era as a tipsy conga line with powdered wigs, let's sip slowly. People weren't staggering through history. Most weren't roaring drunk. They were politely pickled, gently befogged, riding a permanent low-level buzz that made everything from ploughing to parenting slightly more tolerable. Even the founding fathers weren't immune. George Washington ran a rather profitable whiskey distillery later in life. John Adams wrote fondly of starting each day with a tankard of hard cider. Ben Franklin, ever the overachiever, published a list of over 200 euphemisms for being drunk, including nimtopsical, halfway to Concord, and mysteriously, kissed Black Betty's daughter. And as fanciful as this world of daily tippling may sound, it wasn't all tankards and tavern jigs. There was a darker edge lurking behind the merriment. By the mid-1700s, Britain faced something it had never truly dealt with before: the gin craze. Gin, cheap, potent, and easy to distill, poured through the alleys of London like liquid madness. Entire streets seemed devoted to little else. For the first time, the working poor could afford to drink themselves into a stupor, and many did, prompted by bleak circumstances and high-proof dreams. It led to moral panic, satirical art by the likes of Hogarth, and legislation with such charming names as the Tippling Act. but we'll swirl our spoon in that murky cocktail later. For now, just know this. In the 18th century, a light haze over the eyes was simply how people got through their day. It wasn't escapist, it was essential. Alcohol was medicine, beverage, currency, and community ritual. To offer someone a mug was to speak a universal language made of hops, grapes, or apples. The clink of pewter cups was the lullaby of the age. So close your eyes as gently as a tavern door swinging shut, and drift through this world of slow fermentation and historical fuzz. Let the gentle hum of brewing kettles and distant fiddles warm your thoughts like a handy hearth. Next, we'll wander deeper into a place where liberty brews like ale and revolution bubbles like brandy. Chapter 2. The curious case of the water that made you ill. Water, that seemingly innocent liquid responsible for life, and oddly enough, for a surprising amount of 18th century gastrointestinal distress. Picture yourself in the English countryside, perhaps strolling down a cobblestoned lane with an overripe apple tucked into your waistcoat pocket. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and sheep. A distant rooster has unresolved issues with sleep schedules. You reach a humble village well beside a crooked inn with one too many chimney pots. And what do you not do? You don't drink the water, because in the 1700s, doing so would have been roughly equivalent to licking a city bus, if buses had existed and roamed about leaking cholera. Most freshwater sources, wells, ponds, even rain barrels, moonlighted as bacterial amusement parks. Directly drinking water back then wasn't so much a thirst quencher as it was a mild game of microbiological roulette. So people adapted. And by adapted, I mean, they put alcohol in everything. You see, our 18th century ancestors weren't hopelessly tipsy hedonists. Well, not all of them. Many were pragmatists. If the water was quietly plotting your downfall, the solution was to add a bit of barley, perhaps some hops, and let nature do a gentle, fizzy kind of purification. Fermentation wasn't just a flavor decision. It was basic survival science disguised as cheer. Even children drank small beer, a very weak form of ale with just enough alcohol to kill off rogue waterborne microbes, but not so much that little Thomas would forget his Latin verbs before noon. It was a kinder, gentler, underwhelmingly buzzless beverage. Think of it like oat milk if oat milk was slightly bubbly, curious about yeast, and vaguely medieval. Households brewed it in pans the size of sleds, each batch watched over by someone's aunt who insisted she knew the yeast by scent. Taverns had enormous wooden barrels stacked behind the bar like sleepy sentinels, and beer was consumed with meals the way we sip iced tea or, if we're feeling daring, lemon water with a sprig of accusatory mint. But it wasn't just beer. Cider, wine, mead, and the occasionally spicy punch entered the hydration chat. Even the monks, those robe-clad experts in everything from spiritual contemplation to calligraphy, made and consumed ale, not just from piety, but from practicality. Brewing was a holy art. Some abbeys were more famous for their beer than their theology. Londoners, meanwhile, had their own special solution to the water question: gin. Gin was the unofficial spirit of the poor, the middling, and the particularly adventurous middle-aged aunt. It burst into popularity in the 18th century, with enough botanical flair to smell fancy, while ensuring that whatever troubling essence had been sharing your bucket of Thames water would politely cease to be. Unfortunately, gin had a reputation for turning people's limbs wobbly and their decision-making rather creative. "Mother's ruin," they whispered, as if gin arrived in the night and misplaced your petticoat. Taverns began springing up by the row, advertising drinks so strong they could curdle milk at 50 paces. The authorities became so alarmed by the state of public wobbliness that they passed the Gin Act of 1736, a law so unpopular it nearly caused a national sulk. And yet, people persisted in their pursuit of liquid safety by means of mild intoxication. Milk, of course, was an option, but it was not particularly trusted, spoiling fast on warm days and silently plotting to curdle under your nose. Tea was on the rise, yes, but only among those who could afford its leafy grace and weren't enraged by taxation, imperialism, or both. So for much of the population, a pint of something fermented was simply breakfast. Now, before we judge our slightly wobbly ancestors, remember, they weren't seeking a party. They were just trying to stay hydrated without contracting 37 species of bacteria. They did what any practical person might do. They turned water into beer and beer into a lifestyle. So if you've ever had a week where your only accomplishment was making a hot drink and sitting very still, know that you and a Georgian farmer have something in common: survival, one sip at a time. And now, as the candles flicker low and the ale cools in its clay mug, let us quietly wander toward the next curious concoction that made hydration somehow theatrical. Chapter 3: Tea and the Treachery of Water. Let us tiptoe now into the quiet scullery of history, where kettles sing, hearthfires flicker, and every mug of something warm holds just a touch of survival instinct. In the 18th century, a glass of water was often more of a gamble than a refreshment. Water, bless its transparent little heart, was considered suspicious, if not downright dangerous. A clear stream might sparkle like a diamond under the morning sun, but drink from it, and you might spend the next 3 days becoming intimately acquainted with the concept of dysentery. You see, taps as we know them did not exist. The idea of citywide safe water infrastructure was, how shall we say, still in its gloomy adolescence. Wells were unreliable, rivers even less so, and cesspits had a perplexing habit of leaking their foul intentions into the neighborhood aquifer. And so, people reached for what they knew wouldn't kill them. Or at least, what seemed like it wouldn't. Ale, cider, small beer, wine, even something called perry, which was fermented pear juice, the drink of choice for people who liked their beverages the way they liked their poetry. Slightly obscure and probably French, but it wasn't all barmaids and clinking tankards. By day, the working poor reached for short, small beer, just strong enough to keep cholera away, but weak enough to swig with your porridge. Yes, breakfast beer, because nothing says good morning like a light alcoholic haze and a suspicious bowl of oats. Even children were encouraged to partake. Mind you, not in celebratory champagne, but in that sober, mid-strength variety of liquid bread. Think of it less as indulgence and more as hydration with flair. And yet, amid the fog of tipples and tankards, something remarkable began happening. An imported habit from halfway across the globe that utterly enchanted the tea tables of Europe. Enter England's collective crush on tea. Now, tea had been steeping in China for centuries before the British set sail with pockets full of silver and a tendency toward empire building. But in the 1700s, it tiptoed into the British mainstream like a shy suitor bearing gifts, warmth, civility, and the subtle promise of not being bacterial. Boil the water, steep the leaves, and suddenly, your suspicious water was not only tolerable, but chic, even safe-ish. Tea became fashionable, then habitual, then political. There were taxes on it, scandals about it, black markets for it. Parliament lost its collective wig over it. People dumped it into harbours in protest, and entire wars were partially caffeinated by its slippery charm. But for our gentle story tonight, the more enchanting part is this. Tea, unlike ale, required boiling water, which meant if you drank tea, the chances of being undone by E. coli were dramatically reduced. Did people at the time understand bacteria? Not quite. The microscope was still growing into itself. Germ theory hovered somewhere between science and superstition, but intuitively they noticed something. Those who drank boiled leafy water got sick less often, and they looked, if only slightly, more respectable doing it. Cups and saucers became aspirational. Tea sets were status symbols. Servants practiced the perfect tea pour with the precision of a naval drill. The teaspoon was born, not just as a unit of measurement, but as a mark of civilization. And somewhere amidst the steam and chatter, a great transition brewed, from boozy survival drinks to sober social rituals. Still, as with all cultural shifts, it was not complete nor immediate. Many a breakfast table bore both a teapot and a tankard, coexisting like cautious in-laws. Because let's be honest, sometimes you needed something warm and civil, and sometimes you simply needed a flagon of fermented apple and a moment alone. By the end of the century, tea had carved a quiet empire across the drawing rooms of Europe. It had softened the edges of rough mornings and inserted itself into the very rhythm of the day. And while the streets still reeked of ale, and children still wobbled to school on slightly tipsy legs, the kettle had begun to sing a new song. A song of boiled water, of cautious optimism, of scones and soft gossip, and of a world slowly learning that perhaps water, when given fire and fragrant leaves, could be a friend after all. Now, as we let the steam curl upward and the porcelain clink gently to rest, let us wander next into the curious world of drinking habits with powdered wigs and pickled politicians, where the lines between respectability and inebriation were but faintly drawn. Chapter 4. Teacups and tankards, the curious case of breakfast booze. Close your eyes and picture a quiet English morning in the year 1737. The sun has yet to properly rise, stretching its golden fingers over mossy rooftops, unwinding sleepy fog from chimney pots. Somewhere, a rooster offers his opinion too loudly, but inside the kitchen, under low wooden beams, a woman in a lace cap is pouring beer into a mug for her son, who is 5. Welcome to the breakfast table of the 18th century, where juice was suspicious, milk was, let's say, hazardous, and water, well, water was a dice roll you were never advised to take before noon, or after, or really, ever. And so, beer. But this wasn't the festival-grade tankard of modern imagination. No, the ale of the 18th century breakfast menu was what we might today call small beer, a gentle potion with just enough alcohol to make it safer than water, and strong enough to help you ignore the state of your wig. Often made at home and consumed by everyone from toothless infants to their toothless grandparents, small beer was the Gatorade of its time, hydrating, comforting, and occasionally suspiciously cloudy. It was just thick enough to count as food, and just boozy enough to make staring at a mud wall seem like a thrilling morning pastime. Imagine you're a dock worker with knees that already creak like old door hinges, and it's dawn near the Thames. What better way to greet the day than with a hearty bowl of porridge and something brewed last Wednesday in your cousin's bathtub? That's not just breakfast, it's civic survival. In rural villages, where piped water was as fictional as dragons and far less useful, small beer was a kitchen staple. The brewing kettles shared space with soup pots, and recipes varied with scandalous flair. Mildly sour, vaguely oatish, and occasionally offering notes of hay and forgotten socks, small beer was homemade chemistry with a hint of domestic adventure. And for those with a more monastic palate, cider became the orchard-born alternative. In parts of England and colonial America, cider was consumed daily by both the devout and the indecisive. It offered the tang of apples, the warmth of fermentation, and the delightful mystery of not knowing how drunk it was going to make you, depending on how well Uncle Marv measured during the last batch. Even more upscale households found ways to keep up, with punch. Not the festive holiday kind we sip today, mind you. No, 18th century punch was a complex, slightly theatrical concoction featuring rum, citrus, tea, sugar, and sometimes enough spice to make a sailor sit down and question his life. Punch bowls were ladled out at breakfast meetings, weddings, and quite seriously, funerals. It was the smoothie of the Enlightenment, if your smoothie could also make you forget most of Wednesday. But there was logic to the madness. You see, water sources, particularly in bustling towns or bubbling cities, were often unreliable companions. Picture a city aqueduct traveling merrily from a stream downstream of a tannery, past open sewer alleys, through 3 goose ponds, and finally into your ceramic cup. A healthy dose of small beer suddenly seems like a brilliant life choice. And so, fermented drinks filled the gap between thirst and caution. Alcohol, however mild, could help kill off bacteria in water, while boiling in the brewing process was a sneaky bonus. The landscape of alcohol was woven into the rhythm of daily life. Beer with breakfast, ale with lunch, perhaps a bit of fortified wine in the late afternoon, and an evening spirit or two to say goodnight to your liver. No one was necessarily falling off ladders or yelling at the moon by midday, but everyone walked around with the gentle glaze of a life slightly softened by barley. Even children were not exempt. They sipped small beer like today's toddlers clutch juice boxes. History did not grant them orange slices after soccer practice. They got ale after helping with the potato harvest. Of course, attitudes started to shift. New drinks arrived from distant lands, tea from China, coffee from the Middle East, and chocolate from the Americas. These warm, bitter brews changed things. They sobered us up, or at least made us jittery with a dash of anthropology. But before the rise of the teacup came the reign of the tankard. And if you're wondering how colonial Americans mirrored these morning habits across the sea, well, let's just say, many a founding document was likely drafted between mugs of cider and a suspiciously strong breakfast toddy. But now, let the taste of small beer fade from your memory like foam on a sleepy pint. Ahead lies a new scent. Bold and freshly ground, exotic, bitter, and just beginning to travel on the wings of imperial ambition. We'll tiptoe next into the world of colonial coffee houses, where revolution, rumour, and robust aromas all brewed under the same wooden rafters. Chapter 5: Teacups, Tankards, and Tipsy Toddlers. If you ever find yourself sipping tea under a woolen blanket and wondering, did people really drink beer for breakfast? The answer, dear listener, is yes, quite frequently, and not just for breakfast, but lunch, supper, and that in-between moment when your neighbour drops by with gossip and a suspicious pie. Welcome to the wide, wobbly world of 18th century hydration, where the water was treacherous, the beer was barely beer, and toddlers occasionally staggered, though in fairness, they do that even sober. Let's ever so gently uncork the tale. Now, imagine a glass of 18th century water. Clear, pure, delicately refreshing. Oh no, no, no. The average city puddle today, complete with a floating cigarette and a confused pigeon, might still boast a more appetizing bouquet. In urban hubs like London or Paris, water sources were, quite literally, communal broths, brimming with runoff, the occasional horse, and whatever mysteries flowed downstream. It was a lucky day if your pitcher of water didn't come with a side of typhoid. Thus, fermented beverages became the safe harbor in a stormy sea of microbial mischief. Ale, cider, and wine were not just indulgences. They were hydration, medicine, and social glue, all poured into one pleasantly buzzing cup. But don't picture people chugging heavy stouts or fruity Merlot at 9 a.m. No, these were often what they called small ales or table beers, light, low alcohol affairs with just enough fermentation to keep the bad bugs out and the mood buoyant. Think of it like Gatorade for the Georgian era, but earthier and brewed by your aunt. In fact, speaking of aunts, much of this brewing was done at home, often by women. Domestic brewing was considered entirely normal. Wealthy households had dedicated brew houses, while more modest homes might see the wash basin double as a fermentation chamber. Whether or not that contributed to the taste is anyone's guess, and best left unconfirmed. Even children drank ale. And here we must pause, briefly, to dispel the image of a cherub-cheeked toddler nursing a flagon. These small beers had alcohol levels so minuscule that calling them beer was more a courtesy than chemistry. Still, it was just enough to keep the waterborne plagues at bay and give the nursery a slight whiff of hops. In boarding schools, records show beer rations for students as young as 5 or 6, though whether the students actually needed it or simply preferred it to whatever else was on offer, namely boiled cabbage and Latin grammar, is hard to say. Either way, beer break may have once preceded recess. Even monks, icons of solemn sobriety, were known to brew and imbibe in moderation. The Trappists, for example, working in holy silence, but brewing earthy ales so divine you'd want to take communion twice. Their secret? Just the right amount of yeast, and centuries of trial, error, and prayer. But of course, this cozy relationship with fermented beverages wasn't without its hiccups, quite literally. There were blurred lines between moderation and mirthful excess. Pub culture in England bloomed in the 1700s, with alehouses serving as equal parts tavern, newsstand, job board, and community centre. Gossip brewed faster than beer, and the floors were varnished with the echoes of tankards gone sideways. One can't speak of 18th century drink without whispering the word gin. It was Britain's potion of choice by the mid-1700s, a clear, crisp spirit that began as medicine and quickly became, well, stay tuned. For now, just know this. You could buy a dram of gin from a street vendor in a tiny ceramic bottle shaped like a mother cradling a baby, poignantly called Mother's Ruin. Cozy, isn't it? The way drink flowed not just through spectacles and scandals, but through daily life like a warm, yeasty undercurrent. Beer softened the blow of bad water, cider sweetened long harvest days, and wine. Well, wine has always been good at bringing poets and politicians down a notch. So when you sip your modern chamomile or carbonated water, remember those who came before, who raised a mug not purely for pleasure, but because the tap might betray them. And while they may have been slightly drunk a fair bit of the time, they were also slightly safer because of it. Now, snuggle deeper into the covers and let the candlelight of history flicker low. Soon, we'll drift into dimly lit inns, questionable gin, and the rising tide of drink's darker side. Chapter 6. the secret society of breakfast beers. At first light on an autumn morning in 1742, if you happened to drift through the foggy hedgerows of an English village, you might catch the faint clatter of pewter tankards being set down on rough-hewn kitchen tables. Yes, believe it or not, dear dreamer, once upon a time, in a world not so far from your pillow, the world said to itself, water is for ducks, humans. We drink beer for breakfast. Not only beer, but ale, small beer, a quaint little brew softened and watered down like a napkin at a tea party. And it was served routinely at breakfast, lunch, and, naturally, just in case clarity tried to sneak in, dinner. You see, back in the 18th century, water had trust issues. It had a reputation for being home to many invisible and uninvited guests, microbes, parasites, and the occasional nasty bit of dysentery. People knew something was wrong with it, even if they didn't yet have microscopes or catchy scientific words like bacteria or gastroenteritis. The result? A civilization that collectively decided that fermentation was safer than hydration. Small beer was their solution, brewed just enough to ward off whatever it was that made raw water dangerous, but mild enough that even children could partake without accidentally joining a sea shanty crew. Imagine little Thomas, age 7, in his homespun breeches, sipping from his wooden mug while nibbling on a chunk of rye bread. He probably wasn't drunk, but certainly pleasantly uninspired by algebra. Now, before your modern-day eyebrows leap into the skeptical sunset, let it be known that this wasn't your rebellious uncle's beer. Small beer had an alcohol content so low, it would hardly make a fruitcake blush. It was barely enough to count, but just enough to outwit the microorganisms. You might say society functioned on a quiet thrum of mild tipsiness. Judges passed sentences after their ale-soaked porridge. Farmers ploughed fields with their thirst quenched in hops. Even the clergy, yes, those paragons of restraint, enjoyed their monastic brews, sometimes brewed right in the church's own little stone kitchen, nestled in shadow and steam. It was all carefully, blissfully normal. In fact, some folks at the time were suspicious of people who stayed too sober. A man who drank only water was seen as eccentric at best, and possibly untrustworthy. After all, what was he hiding by being so crisp? In taverns, which blossomed along cobblestone streets like mushrooms after rain, the line between breakfast and happy hour blurred with cozy indifference. Patrons sipped and shared stories, dogs curled near iron stoves, and fireplaces dared the mist to cut through their toasted glow. In cities like London, the humble beer morning even held its own against the growing threat of coffee, bless its bracing little beans. Coffee marched in with a foreign flair, promising energy, enlightenment, and revolution. But for the average cobbler or baker, who needed liquid courage just to face a Monday of street muck and unpredictable horses, beer was still the preferred dawn companion. And how sweetly patient that world was, without a single alarm clock, just the sun, a bit of warm bread, and a sip of something malty, earthy, and approximately 1.5% alcohol. There's something gentle about imagining an entire society just slightly softened around the edges, like a canvas dabbed with honeyed hues. Productivity might have lagged a bit, yes. Perhaps a speech or two wobbled off topic, but for the most part, people got along just fine with their daily brew, their pub chats, and their mutually agreed upon fuzzy reality. Of course, things would gradually change. Public health would learn to tame the invisible monsters in the well. Stronger drinks would come into fashion, and with them, consequences far less endearing. But in this moment, this muffled, candlelit pocket of the past, The breakfast beer was king, and while it's perhaps not advisable to adopt their nutritional habits, there's something oddly comforting in knowing that our ancestors began their days not with a sprint, but with a sip. Softly, gently, as the daylight yawned over mossy rooftops and windmill blades turned like thoughtful clock hands, the world uncurled a little slower. And speaking of curling up, let's continue wandering through this pleasantly peculiar haze, where customs fermented as quietly as the barrels tucked behind the hearth. Chapter 7. The Secret Lives of Saloon Cats and Tavern Dogs. If you were to gently open the creaking door of a Georgian-era tavern, say in the year 1763, you'd find more than just sloshed philosophers and red-faced cobblers arguing over the price of molasses. No, you'd also find the subtle rustle of four paws underfoot, and a glint of watchful eyes beneath a pinewood bench. Because tucked between tankards and stools, half snoozing beside whiskey barrels, lived the real patrons of 18th century public houses, the saloon cats and tavern dogs. Now, the official reason given for harbouring these animals was pest control. Of course, that's the sort of thing respectable folks say when their cat has taken up full-time residence on the fireplace mantel, and their dog has a higher seat at the tavern than the town magistrate. Cats, especially, had a strategic role. Taverns, being quite crumb-rich, were beloved stomping grounds for mice and the occasional rat with bold ambitions. With meat pies cooling on windowsills and barrels of grain stacked like edible Jenga towers, the feline employees were, in theory, on the payroll. Well, not that they'd ever follow anyone's orders, but they were permitted to nap on any surface they pleased and were occasionally paid in bits of sausage crust. Then there were the tavern dogs. Chunky, soot-furred fellows with greying muzzles and tails that thumped quietly against wooden floors. They were loyal to the barkeep in the way that only a creature who's been fed a lifetime of kidney pudding and ale dribbles can be. Some helped haul small carts, some guarded the door with theatrical growls, and some simply sat there, tail slowly wagging, listening to the same story about the same fish that had grown a new inch each year since 1730. One such tavern, the Sleepy Pint in Suffolk, reportedly had a terrier named Admiral Pickle, who became quite famous in his day. He wore an old tricorn hat on Sundays, barked precisely once at the local tax collector, which earned him free liver for a month, and had the uncanny ability to nap precisely where drunk patrons were about to trip. Admirable work. You might be wondering if these animals ever drank. Officially, no. Unofficially, yes. House cats often lapped up cream tipped with brandy when charitable souls, already several pints into their philosopher's debate, decided the cat looked a bit dry. Dogs, ever eager to belong, sometimes got a slurp of watered-down ale. And there are at least 2 semi-trustworthy diaries referencing a spaniel named Buttons, who may or may not have licked the foam off a porter mug and then walked into a wall. Twice. But more than just companions, animals in taverns were a form of cozy spectacle. Remember, this was a time before smartphones, radio, or even widely available books. In many rural communities, the local pub was the epicenter of news, entertainment, and vinegar-slathered gossip. And if that tavern also housed Mildred, a calico cat who once chased a pickpocket across 4 tables and into a barrel of pickles, well then, congratulations. You had yourself a legend. Historians even credit some of these pub pets with stirring small moments of civic kindness. It's one thing to watch a neighbour fall off his bench in a whiskey fog. It's quite another to see him cradling a pug in a hand-knitted waistcoat. It softened people, made them less inclined to duel, or at the very least, more inclined to take turns. Of course, not all pub-based animals were of the furred variety. Some public houses kept parrots, or in rarer, more chaotic cases, goats. There's an account, allegedly, of a pub in Devon where a goat named Humboldt drank half a pint of cider and head-butted a drummer from the militia. The drummer reportedly apologized. So however chaotic and barley-scented these nocturnal dens of sociability may have been, they were also surprisingly wholesome. When people think of the 18th century, they often imagine powdered wigs and revolutions. But down at floor level, beside the hearth, something simpler was happening. Someone was scratching behind a floppy ear, or sharing a crust beneath the table with a purring friend. And so, as the embers glow low and the last of the cider is poured, we leave our contented critters curled by the fire, snoring in time with the creaky rhythm of the floorboards. It's nearly time to shuffle on and peek at another curious corner of this ever-ambling century, where a new cast of characters waits patiently, bottles in hand and stories to share. Chapter 8. The Alewife's Whisper and the Tavern That Never Slept. Let us now drift into a small English village in the year 1734, where the haze of morning mist curls above thatched roofs, and the rooster's crow is met not with sun salutations, but with a mild grumble and another slosh of beer. Here, the tavern is not just a watering hole. Oh no. It is a civic centre, a post office, a debating hall, and often a bed and breakfast for people who couldn't quite make it home. But before we peek into the creaking doors of the Old Swan or the Drunken Partridge, let's raise a dainty toast to the women behind the barrels, the alewives. These were not just women who brewed beer. These were legendary figures in their cloaks of hops and skirts dusted with flour. Brewing was, for much of medieval and early modern Europe, a domestic craft. Quite literally, beer was made by mothers. And the alewife, she was the cornerstone of the slightly drunk world. Our story tonight considers one such alewife. Let's call her Agnes. Her hands smelled perpetually of malt and mystery. She rose before the cockerel muttered so much as a syllable, and she stirred her mash with the calm precision of someone plotting gentle world domination with barley. Agnes brewed not for ceremony, but out of necessity. Water, as we've murmured before, was a gamble. Boiling made it safer, fermentation made it sociable, and alcohol gave it stamina. And so, into the copper kettle went the secrets of the grain. Out came small beer, low in alcohol, high in hope, consumed by men, women, children, and, once, a temporary bishop who got lost near Gloucester. A good alewife could gain local fame. A truly great one could influence elections, settle feuds, and name local ducks. The sign of the alewife's home was typically a broom or a branch hung outside the door. It was a subtle message. Knock politely and bring your coin. Now Agnes, you must understand, didn't simply sling drink. She ran a one-room tavern from her front parlour, which smelled of nutmeg, leather boots, and well-aired gossip. Locals gathered there under the pretense of having a mild one, which, as in all centuries, escalated rather quickly. This was a place of fermented democracy. The blacksmith would proposition philosophy, the midwife would expound on taxation, and if someone shouted the Whigs were right, there was a collective groan and a request for another round. No matter the topic, Agnes poured with the uncanny ability to level egos and encourage napping. Across the pond, colonial America mirrored this slightly buzzed conviviality. Taverns were mandatory in many towns, legally required so travelers could find shelter and sustenance. If your town didn't have one, you were either invisible to the mapmakers or due for a stiff municipal letter. Many early American laws, curled and browned with time, included exacting standards for tavern behaviour, such as no denying a man his pint, lest he do expire from general disappointment. But Agnes, curled in the Steamshire countryside, wasn't concerned about colonial bylaws. She was more interested in her regulars, Thomas with the whittled cane, and stories so tall villagers suspected stilts. Betsy Ann, who sang sea shanties despite never laying eyes on an ocean, and Giles, who believed the moon was following him and often offered it a drink. These were the gentle citizens of perpetual ale. They were never roaring drunk, at least not on weekdays, but wore a slight, perpetual warmth like a well-loved shawl. It dulled the sharper edges of life, the unpaved lanes, the relentless cold, and the occasional taxman with a resting scowl. By candlelight, taverns weren't simply places to drink. They were theatres of stories, repositories of village lore. You see, in a world without Wi-Fi, or even, dare we say, flush toilets, sharing stories over a mug of ale was both entertainment and an early form of data storage. Oral traditions soaked in barley, and so we leave Agnes now, wiping her hands on her apron as she eyes the bready foam of her next batch. Her cat, named Parliament, dozes beside the hearth. Outside, the moon nods, perhaps to Giles, and the tavern fades into soft silence. Of course, tomorrow the door will creak again, and another day of gentle revelry will begin, as essential as the rising sun and the ever-bubbling kettle. Let us drift onward now toward the curious clink of medicine bottles and the apothecaries who, well, let's just say they had opinions about alcohol too. Chapter 9. Honey, we shrunk the grog, naval spirits and sea legs. Out on the creaking high seas, where the salt air mingled with the stubborn scent of old rope and sailor sweat, there existed a peculiar floating tradition, a daily dose of diluted cheer, ladled straight into tin cups, served with a side of grumbling and slurred sea shanties. Yes, dear listener, tonight we set sail into the choppy, rum-scented waters of 18th century naval drink culture. Picture it, the British Royal Navy in the 1700s, masts towering like wooden cathedrals, sails sighing in the breeze, and the crew, barely awake yet, already queuing for their daily ration of naval grog. The term itself has the warmth of a befuddled uncle's nickname, doesn't it? That's because it was named after one. Enter Admiral Edward Vernon, known affectionately, if a tad mockingly, as Old Grog, because he was fond of wearing a grogram cloak, a sort of drizzly-looking mix of silk, wool and misery. In 1740, Old Grog decreed that all sailors' rum rations must be diluted with water. The idea was to curb drunkenness aboard ships, though ironically, it just made sailors drink it faster before it could evaporate or be noticed. And thus, grog was born. Half-pint rum, a quart of water, and if you were lucky, a splash of citrus to prevent scurvy, and lend the whole affair a faint echo of cocktail hour. But why rum, you ask, when the ships themselves were closer to floating barrelling stations filled with beer in the earlier centuries? Ah well, beer soured at sea, not to mention it took up astonishing amounts of space. Rum, on the other hand, came from the West Indies, was high-proof, compact, and could outlast a voyage and several storms. It was durable, like hardtack biscuits, but significantly more cheerful. Of course, to truly appreciate the naval rum tradition, we must peek into a sailor's daily life. Imagine waking to the scent of brine, sweat, and yesterday's salted meat. You sway down the ladder, bleary-eyed and bruised by dreams of storms. But lo, a bell clangs. A boatswain calls out, and into your hand is thrust a dripping ladle of warm, watery rum, the very taste of life afloat, somewhere between a gentle nod to morale and outright bribe to keep from mutiny. The grog ritual was sacred, part refreshment, part ritual, part clever psychological warfare. Commanders found that supplying this liquid comfort at regular hours made life aboard more bearable. After all, sailors were perpetually damp, half frozen, and engaged in the constant battle against boredom, barnacles, and backaches. A bit of numbing was quite welcome. Still, sometimes the grog wasn't enough to drown out a sailor's complaints or his tendency to chase additional inebriation. Down among the hammocks, clever hands would ferment anything vaguely suspicious into makeshift booze. Molasses, fruit, shoe polish. If it could be coaxed into bubbling, someone would drink it. Shall we speak of American ships? Much the same, though with a rebellious twist. Colonial sailors often preferred straight rum, perhaps stirred with defiance and a pinch of patriotism. French and Spanish sailors brought wine and brandy to sea, sailing their own boozy ships into fate and foam. More than mere tradition, naval drinking rituals bonded crews. Sharing grog was egalitarian, the same mushy mix for officers and deckhands alike, doled out justly, at least in theory. Cups raised on the creaking deck under star-blown skies gave momentary unity to men divided by rank, origin, and facial hair. There were, however, limits. Overindulgence could land a sailor in the brig or at the business end of a cat o' nine tails. Thus, the path to blissful tipsiness was a narrow gangplank, always one sip away from disaster. By the end of the 18th century, sailors had grogged their way across oceans, explored strange continents, and occasionally lost the plot altogether. But their boozy little mugs became symbols of survival, a portable morale boost, a reward, a bribe, and a warm, fuzzy bandage for the soul. So the next time you sip something dark and stormy, remember the men who drank grog on rolling ships, their eyes on the horizon, their minds a little foggy, and their legs entirely unreliable. Somewhere just past those misty waves of history and diluted rum lies a tale not of sailors, but of monks, and a very curious connection between divine silence, ticklish fermentation, and the surprising number of brewing robes worn behind abbey walls. But first, let's tuck our sea legs under a blanket and drift. Chapter 10. Tea, Temperance and Tipsiness, a very British hard dilemma. As the clocks ticked through the candle-lit corridors of the 18th century, something rather peculiar began brewing in Britain, literally. In a land where ale had long been a breakfast beverage and beer a suitable companion for one's porridge, a strange leaf from distant Asia began to unsettle the social order. It was called tea, and it was about to cause quite a stir in more ways than one. You see, Britain's flirtation with drunkenness wasn't just cultural, it was deeply practical. Water, that clear elixir of life, had developed quite the reputation, and not a flattering one. Teeming with mysterious microscopic troublemakers, water from the town well or river often delivered more ailment than ambrosia. Thus, the British had found safer solace in drinkables that had been boiled or fermented. Enter alcohol, blessedly sterile, warming, and only sometimes responsible for impromptu ballads in the town square. But then, drifting gently from cargo ships arriving from the East India Company, came tea leaves, exotic, aromatic, and requiring boiling to consume. A revelation. This meant you could enjoy a hot beverage without the added poetry of fermented barley. Curious, isn't it? As tea crept into drawing rooms and parlours, especially among the middle and upper classes. It threatened, in its gentle way, to unseat alcohol from its throne as the default daily drink. It was seen as clean, refined, civilizing even. Tea didn't demand a barmaid or cause you to fall asleep in a hedge. It let you sit upright, pinky elegantly extended, and gossip at great length about your neighbour's curtains. But not everyone was sipping comfortably. Public houses, where ale had long flowed freer than conversation, began to feel the sting. As more people reached for teapots instead of tankards, landlords worried the nation might trade in their beloved booziness for something alarmingly sober. Some even declared, in mildly slurred proclamations, that tea would be the undoing of British masculinity. After all, what gentleman would opt for a dainty cup of Ceylon over a pint of frothy brown mystery? And yet, for all this fear, tea didn't exactly bring on a golden age of hydration. No sooner had the British embraced tea than they ensured it wouldn't be clean and healthy for long. Enter the sugar. Sweet, alluring sugar, another colonial darling, was shipping into Britain by the ton, often from tragic plantations in the Caribbean. Tea provided the perfect excuse to consume sugar with abandon. A cube here, a spoonful there, and before long, it wasn't just the drink that had grown addictive. So while tea gave the illusion of temperance, it brought its own blend of long-term trouble, in the form of sleepy mid-morning crashes and toothaches that echoed through time. Furthermore, the class divide pranced its way right into the teacup. Tea became a symbol of genteel society. Working folk, still clinging to their mugs of small beer, which was low in alcohol and more hydrating than dangerous water, now appeared, at least to the elite, as uncivilized, thus rehydrating the old tension between rich etiquette and functional thirst. And just when it seemed like tea had gotten tipsiness on the ropes, along came another contender, gin. But oh patience, dear sleeper, we'll twirl the juniper-scented drama of gin another evening. For now, picture a Briton torn between its love of merry inebriation and the whisper of porcelain elegance. Picture a drawing room where ladies gently debate the merits of Darjeeling, while in some nearby tavern, someone falls off a stool mid-sentence. The nation, it seems, was balancing on the rim of a teacup and the edge of a tankard, not quite ready to choose between sobriety and stews of barley. As the fireplace crackles and the teapot softly sighs, remember, nothing in history changes abruptly. It steeps, like all the best things. And in our next whispered turn through time, we'll wander into a place where gin glistened with danger. Mothers became infamous, and the phrase "drunk as a wheelbarrow" nearly became a medical diagnosis. But hush now, let the night settle. The tea is warm, the hearth is glowing, and somewhere out there, a British gentleman is trying to decide whether to dunk his biscuit in tea or beer. Chapter 11. Tea's Tiny Rebellion, when boiling water became fashionable. Long before afternoon tea was an Instagrammable affair served on floral china, it was whispered into English drawing rooms like a mild revolution in a porcelain cup. Tonight, we step quietly into the steamy swirl of the 18th century's most civilized rebellion, the rise of tea, and how it, astonishingly, helped chip away at the empire of inebriation. Yes, amid the clinking of tankards and the slurred poetics of ale-soused poets, tea emerged like a well-mannered cousin showing up with a doily and a mission. Let us set the scene. It's London circa 1715. The streets are cobbled, the air is thick with chimney smoke, and babies are being lovingly baptized in beer to ensure their survival. But something is stirring in the drawing rooms of the modestly wealthy. A dainty, bitter beverage, imported from the Far East, is making delicate waves. Tea had arrived in drizzled England all the way from China, thanks to the East India Company, an organization that somehow managed to be both a trading company and a gentle precursor to global capitalism, wrapped in ornamental lacquer. The leaves were sold by the ounce, stored in locked caddies, and steeped slowly, a luxury that required time, patience, and more boiling than a lobster at a summer gala. Here's where our sleepy history dips its biscuit into something interesting. Tea required boiled water. Now, in a time when the Thames flowed more like chunky soup than refreshing spring, boiling water was a radical act of health, though of course no one quite knew it yet. They just knew it made tea taste better and unlikely to give you dysentery. You see, the average Londoner wasn't exactly interested in a sober beverage. Remember, ale and small beer were consumed even at breakfast, partly because they had the noble distinction of not killing you. You could trust it had been brewed, boiled, and stored in a way that wouldn't invite cholera to your crumpet party. But tea, oh delicate, floral, gossamer-stranded tea, it demanded etiquette. Teacups were fragile. You couldn't slam them down like a tankard of cider. Well, you could, but you'd gain a reputation as the sort who throws punches at bridge. More interestingly, tea had a cleanliness about it. Tea didn't have you singing sea shanties in the town square or mistaking a lamppost for your wife. It made people sit straighter, speak softer, and gossip just a tad more exquisitely. And somehow, this quiet little leaf became fashionable, which is perhaps the greatest magic of capitalism, turning boiling water into a status symbol. It wasn't just a beverage, it was a ritual. One didn't just drink tea, one partook. Saucers were held, pinkies occasionally raised, though far less than modern myths insist, and biscuits appeared, making their crumbly debut as accessories to the beverage of choice. And with tea came tea houses, which were genteel alternatives to the beer-soaked inns and gin-scented tenements of lower society. Now, keep the kettle singing softly in your imagination, because tea also played a rather cheeky part in shaking loose some imperial wrinkles. The British taxed it heavily, and while that may seem unremarkable in the grand darts game of colonial finance, it caused something of a spat across the ocean. But that's a sleepy mugful for another time. Back in cozy Georgian parlours, tea-drinking women were becoming curious political creatures. The tea table became a domestic parliament, where ideas steeped alongside loose leaves. While the men bellowed their debates in beer halls and coffee houses, women curated conversations over teacups, quietly weaving influence in a society that supposedly expected them only to embroider, pour milk, and swoon fetchingly at garden parties. Not to be underestimated, a woman with a teapot was a creature of both refinement and quiet resistance. Tea was her tool, her signal, her power, and possibly her antidote to a life otherwise surrounded by brandy-soaked decisions. And so, in this age of powdered wigs and wooden teeth, something miraculous occurred. For the first time, people had a reason, however tiny, to drink something that didn't come with a hangover or a musty cellar smell. It was warmth in a cup, gentility in liquid form, and possibly the most influential beverage served while sitting down. As our cup cools and the leaves settle, let the curl of imaginary steam carry you onward to the sugar trails of empire and the sweet, sticky consequences that followed every ladleful. Chapter 12. Hops and Dreams. the alewives of yesteryear. Let us drift now through the misty lanes of an English village, a place where thatch-roofed cottages lean slightly with time, and hens patrol the front gardens like tufted sentries. The air smells faintly of yeast, smoke, and mischief. All thanks to one of the most curiously underrated figures of the 18th century beverage boom, the alewife. Before bartenders had suspenders and ironic tattoos, and long before brewing became anyone's side hustle, it was women, particularly women with a good hearth and a nose for fermentation, who ran the show. Alewives, they were called, though they rarely came with scales or fins of any kind. They brewed in batches, not factories, and they did so right at home, their ale bubbling away contentedly in heavy iron cauldrons beside the stew. Most households brewed, but the truly gifted, or the slightly luckier, found themselves at the center of village life, their homes hosting a rotating crowd of thirsty neighbors, scandalous gossip, and the occasional goat that mysteriously wandered in mid-pint. There was prudence in trusting the alewife. After all, this was still the age when water liked to carry along bacteria, parasites, and occasionally a medieval grudge. Boiling liquid for beer, however, killed off the nasty bits and left behind a merry maltiness. So when the villagers said to skip the water and sip the ale, they weren't being coy. They were being microbiologically sound. Now, in the grand tradition of humans meddling with perfectly reasonable things, not everyone was thrilled about these modest matriarchs of malt. Some church authorities and proto-bureaucrats began to frown upon ladies profiting from libations. Around the 15th century, they pushed for regulations. Ale conners were appointed to monitor quality and taxation. These officials would arrive, solemn and grim, wearing cloaks full of self-importance, only to plop onto ale-soaked stools to determine if the bench stuck to their breeches. That, you see, was the test of a sticky beer. A bit theatrical, yes, but wildly satisfying. By the 1700s, the term brewster, indicating a female brewer, gave way to broader industry terms. Brewing carved its path toward masculinity and mechanization. But still, in the rural corners and whispered corners of busy towns, alewives brewed on. They wore aprons stained with hops, spoke with weathered charm, and dispensed both pints and neighborly wisdom. Recipes were guarded like family secrets. Some had herbs thought to calm the nerves. Some hinted oddly at licorice and nettles. One particular herb mattered most of all: hops, that most curious little cone-shaped flower, which gave beer its bitter flavor. While ale had existed for centuries, hopping, it was still a newish twist as far as the English were concerned. The Dutch had been wild about hops, and possibly just wild in general, since the 14th century. But it took stout English stubbornness a while to warm to the taste. Some even called it a wicked and pernicious weed. And yet, once English palates caught on, hops became the toast of taverns, a magic ingredient that not only extended shelf life but also, ironically, reduced spoilage by bacteria. One could now say, this pint is kept by hops, and mean both taste and science. Alewives learned to adapt once more, adding these feisty flowers to their recipes to keep up with changing tastes and taxes. Yes, taxes again. Every time the government realized people were spending more on ale than sense, a new fee seemed to arise. By the dawn of industrial brewing, alehouses were being licensed, measured, and interrogated within an inch of their frothy existence. But somehow, between the shadows of chimney smoke and the clink of ceramic mugs, the spirit of the alewife endured. So tonight, while our modern beers sit neatly labelled in refrigerators, and our coffee tables lack the sticky test of centuries past, it's worth pausing to think of those women presiding over their cauldrons, gently coaxing warmth, flavor, and just enough fermentation to keep the world smiling softly. Close your eyes, and you might still hear the cheerful slosh of a wooden ladle, the murmur of friends assembled in the hearthlight, stories rising like steam above the brew. And now, dear sleeper, let us leave behind the sound of simmering ale and quietly follow the path toward another curious habit of the age, why even the milkmaids were tipsy before dawn. Chapter 13. The Art of Alewives and Muddled Mead Making. Let us slip calmly now through the crooked door of a countryside brewhouse, its wooden hinges creaking like a sleepy sigh. The air hums with a dozen scents, roasting barley, fermenting fruit, and a hint of damp woolen cloaks drying by the hearth. In the steaming kettle, the mysterious alchemy of mead and ale bubbles quietly, like secrets being whispered by warm ghosts from the past. As you settle in, perhaps with a woolen shawl about your shoulders, let us drift into the frothy, fascinating world of the 18th century brewer, particularly those unsung heroes of hops and fermentation, the alewives. Before commercial breweries gleamed with copper vats and stern accountants, beer and mead were largely domestic endeavours, and the great bulk of that homebrew responsibility, oh yes, it belonged to women. Housewives wielded yeast with more confidence than a bishop with holy water. The term alewife wasn't a quirky nickname. It was a vocation, a lifestyle, possibly even a mild identity crisis. Imagine an alewife in her rustic kitchen somewhere in Gloucestershire, apron speckled with flour and foamy wort, children underfoot, and a blackened kettle perched over the blazing hearth. She didn't just make beer because people liked it. No, she made beer because, well, the water wasn't exactly whispering, "Drink me." Drinking straight from the well was like licking the inside of a boot washed in other boots. It could contain charming contaminants like sheep droppings, ditch runoff, and assorted invisible doom. So the alewife brewed. Her work wasn't just a convenience. It was an act of public health, and perhaps mild intoxication. The fermentation process, whether she knew the science or not, made the brew safer. Beer was the Brita filter of the 1700s. Just with more burping, she mixed gruel-like combinations of malted barley and water, stirred with a carved wooden paddle called a mash rake. As the grains soaked and cracked open, they released a pale brown sweetness. This sugary soup, known as wort, was carefully ladled into vessels that, let's face it, were not purpose-built. Buckets? Yes. Surprisingly clean. Sometimes. And then came the yeast, often unconsciously carried from brew to brew on the stirring sticks or in the air itself. The brew would froth, foam, bubble, and, if you listen closely, perhaps hum softly to itself, like a lullaby in barley tongue. After a few days, you had small beer, a low alcohol drink that quenched the thirst of farmhands, milkmaids, and children alike. Because nothing says balanced breakfast like porridge and a pint. Now, dear dreamer, not all alewives were humble homemakers. Some became shrewd business folk, setting up small taverns out of their front rooms. They'd hoist a broom or a branch outside the door, a leafy signpost that read, in the universal language of thirsty villagers, "Yes, we've got booze." But beware, not all alewives were sweet and motherly. Some stretched their batches with herbs of questionable origins, perhaps a handful of wild rosemary, or yes, maybe the odd root dug from a shadowy patch of earth where no hedgehog dared tread. She might substitute hops for something more. experimental, henbane, hemlock, or the ever-trustworthy mystery leaf. This led to the occasional hiccup, hallucination, or inexplicable poetry recital. Still, alewives, good and questionable both, were pillars of their community, often as respected or feared as the village blacksmith or the local priest with the wandering sermon. Now, while we're steeping gently in this tale of homey fermentation, let's take a moment to acknowledge that not all mead and beer was homegrown. In larger towns, professional brewing had begun to rise, much like the head on a freshly poured tankard. But the alewife persisted, an icon of warmth, nourishment, and the delightful hum of drunken bees in the garden hedge. The ale they produced was often light, low in alcohol, and meant for daily sipping, not rowdy revels. More like a cozy cup of sleepy soup than a wild night at the local inn. So tonight, when your eyelids droop like wilted hops on the vine, spare a dream for those unsung brewers of yore, who kept a whole continent both hydrated and slightly tipsy. Now hush. The embers are low, and the alewife has dimmed her lantern. Next, we shall drift to a place where pipes and powdered wigs discuss sobriety and fail. Chapter 14. The Curious Case of Pub Breakfasts and Pickled Hangovers. There's a certain magic to waking slowly, the sun stretching its golden arms through the window panes, the birds gossiping mildly in the hedges, and a gentle smell of bread, mingled with gin vapours. Welcome to breakfast in 18th century England, a time when eggs might arrive at the table alongside a steaming mug of beer, and the words, hair of the dog, were less a turn of phrase and more a loosely agreed upon medical doctrine. Mornings in this gently boozy century rarely began with a green smoothie or a yoga flow. No, the average English breakfast might include sausage, cold ham, pickles, maybe a sweet roll, and definitely, almost unquestionably, ale. Beer wasn't just tolerated at breakfast, it was expected. You wouldn't want your eggs getting lonely. It may sound rather spirited, pun mildly intended, but this behaviour had a surprisingly sensible origin. Since the Middle Ages, ale had a reputation as being safer than water. Boiled during brewing, and sometimes seasoned with herbs that had a mild antimicrobial touch, or at least pretended to, beer was often considered a wholesome beverage compared to the raw, brook-scooped water of cities teeming with questionable gutter arrangements. By the 1700s, small beer, low in alcohol and often consumed by children, clergy and clergy's children, was a staple at meals, breakfasts included. This baby beer, as we might dreamily call it, usually hovered at around 1% to 2% alcohol, enough to keep the microbes at bay, not enough to have you insulting footmen before noon. But not every cup was innocent. The 18th century was also roaring along with schnapps, brandy and gin, taking centre stage among the more ambitious breakfast drinkers. And while there weren't formal mimosa menus yet, there were certainly enterprising souls who believed a quick morning dram was just what the doctor ordered. Quite literally, the phrase medicinal tipple was passed around more often than the salt. Some taverns even rolled open their doors right around dawn, and the phrase eye-opener was sometimes more practical than metaphorical. City folk might stop in for a quick pick-me-up before heading to markets, printers' shops, or wig powdering stations. Imagine strolling bleary-eyed into your local public house only to find Mr. Thistlethwaite deeply involved in a gin and smoked herring situation before sunrise. A bold man, perhaps a troubled man, but in those days, not an unusual one. Domestic households didn't exactly hold back either. Diaries from the period record breakfasts that leaned heavily on fortified wines and medicinal tonics. Tonics, which often included opiates, by the way, though we'll save that dreamy detail for another moment. Now, not all morning potions were the stuff of today's brunch cocktails. Consider the humble bowl of posset, a thick, often eggy mixture of curdled milk and ale or wine, sweetened and spiced, warmed to perfection. It was equal parts breakfast and sedative, and was as likely to put you back in bed as it was to prepare you for the workday. And in truth, that sometimes suited just fine. When most work involved either parchment, buttons, or yelling at someone gently about chimney soot, a mild buzz could be managed quite responsibly. Here's where it gets more whimsical. Those same hearty breakfasts had a secret second job: hangover mitigation. The pickles, eggs, leftover meats, and tactically low alcohol beer made for an unintentional but effective hangover cure. Indeed, eating something solid is one of humanity's oldest solutions to the morning after malaise, and 18th century folk had intuition, if not ibuprofen. Some of the more theatrical cures involved pickled herring, mustard plasters, or a brisk walk in foul weather. All ideas probably invented by sober people trying to punish their more gleeful friends. Strangely, and sleepily enough, in towns like London or York, the fog of early morning mingled with cooking smoke and the faint scent of hops to create an atmosphere that soothed the senses in its own erratic way. The city would yawn itself awake, one wobbling cart and one sloshing tankard at a time. And so, as the tea kettles began to whistle, and the street sweepers did their solemn dance with straw brooms and last night's regrets, the 18th century poured itself a final breakfast dram and shuffled into the day, even if it was slightly sideways. Next, we'll drift into the curious realm of the travelling tavern, those rolling drink carts and portable punch parties of the age. But let's not rush. Rest your mind like a full tankard on a quiet morning table, and let the world fade softly, like fog curling over cobblestones. Chapter 15. The scandalous rise of the teetotaler's cousin, the small beer baby. Softly now, we drift into kitchens damp with steam and the muffled clatter of 18th century pots. Here we find not nobles dueling over ducats, nor poets pondering stars, but mothers and nurses ladling beer into baby bottles. Yes, actual bottles. And yes, actual beer. More like small beer, really. A charming euphemism for what could best be described as bread-flavoured water with commitment issues. But before you cry scandal, remember, this was no frat party. It was survival. A sleepy, boozy sort of survival that began right after swaddling. You see, before anyone had heard of Louis Pasteur or chlorinated pipelines, drinking plain water was a risk not unlike licking a random doorknob during plague season. Streams looked poetic from a distance, but up close they were brimming with unpleasant little mysteries. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, watery names for watery graves. So instead of handing children a cup of pure spring water, which in 1750 was essentially the beverage equivalent of Russian roulette, caregivers reached for something safer. A low-alcohol brew boiled during brewing. A gentle beverage with just enough fermentation to terrify bacteria, but not enough to throw Junior into a full-on toddler tavern brawl. Small beer, as it was cheerily called, was as common at the breakfast table as porridge and parental disappointment. Typically hovering at a mild 0.5% to 2.8% alcohol by volume, it was brewed from the third or even fourth run of mashed grains, the budget-friendly dregs of beer making. The result? a weak, malty liquid that carried the comforting aroma of a half-hearted bakery. Mothers brewed it at home. Brewers supplied it to boarding schools. It was issued to workers, soldiers, and yes, the tiniest citizens of the realm. Infants slurped it from earthenware cups. Toddlers clutched tankards barely bigger than their fists. If you were teething in 1735, odds are you were also tipsy, and yet no one blinked an eye. Alcohol, at least in this diluted form, was not seen as a foppish pleasure or the gateway to gossip. It was a household staple, a hydrational halfway house between deadly water and the intoxicating power of full-bodied wine or rum. Now, let us step into a sleepy alehouse in late August, where the sun is low and the conversation even lower. Here sit 3 generations, each sipping a different strength of brew. Grandfather nurses a strong porter, father enjoys a middling ale, and little Isaac grins through a foam-ringed mouth, clutching his cup of small beer as if it's a wizard's chalice. He has no teeth yet, but he toasts like a champion. You might wonder, did all this child-scale brewing not arouse concern? Occasionally, yes. A few pamphlets fluttered through the streets, decrying moral decay and pickled infants. But most people were far more afraid of diarrhea than drunkenness. A tipsy toddler, they reasoned, could still learn his letters. A sickly one might not live to read at all. Even the great minds weren't immune. Benjamin Franklin once recounted being too poor to buy proper beer while apprenticing in London, and instead settling for the weak stuff. He survived and committed the great mischief of inventing bifocals, a clear case of beer-induced clarity perhaps, or at least something to think about next time your drink goes flat. But as glimmers of modernity crept over the continent, things began to shift. Clean water started to arrive, not from divine providence, but from pipes, pumps, and the relentless march of British engineering. And with sanitation came questions. Does the baby need beer anymore? Could she perhaps survive on milk? Or, in a fit of extravagance, apple juice? By the 19th century, the idea of giving infants alcohol, a concept once as uncontroversial as a warm bonnet, had begun to wrinkle brows and furrow maternal instincts. Small beer slipped slowly into obscurity, sinking beneath the rising tide of pasteurized progress. And yet, in cozy corners of old, manuscripts and crinkled ledgers, the small beer baby still clutches his cup, a whisper of an age when safety came malted, and childhood began with a burp and a toast. Now, as the fire dwindles and the mugs are empty, we close our eyes and tiptoe toward another strange side effect of daily drink, the perils of public lighting and tipsy lamplighters weaving through cobbled streets with flames aloft and dignity at half-mast. Chapter 16. The Wine Windows of Florence and the Whispering Goblets. Let us drift, if you will, to the warm cobblestone hush of old Florence, where the shadows of wine barrels and Renaissance eaves fall softly in the alleyways as the sun sighs over terracotta rooftops. Here, in the 18th century, though the tradition winks even older, one could summon a glass of wine through the wall itself. Yes, truly. The Florentines, ever practical and perennially thirsty, invented what are still known as bouchette del vino, or wine windows. These were tiny apertures, charmingly carved into stone facades, where one could knock gently and be greeted not by a face, but by a disembodied hand extending the elixir of Dionysus in exchange for a few coins and a knowing smile. This was, of course, civilized, and by civilized, we mean the kind of elegant improvisation born of plagues, taxes, and the urgent desire to have a sip without making small talk. Italy, like much of Europe, had its fair share of infectious drama long before the 18th century decided to toss in some extra flourish. Wine windows help maintain both hygiene and social grace. After all, no one wants to gossip about Signora Bernardi's swollen ankles when there's Chianti wafting through a stone hole. The tradition began in the 1600s, but by the 1700s, it had embedded itself into the architecture of thirst. These little wine portals served not just nobles and merchants, but tailors, bakers, laundresses, anyone whose soul could be uplifted by a midday sip, which is to say, almost everyone. It was the drive-through window, before carriages had cup holders. What made these wine windows so special, beyond the unspoken thrill of receiving Merlot from a mystery hand, was that they blended anonymity with ritual. A tiny bell might tinkle. You'd state your wine of choice, likely a local varietal, born just beyond the city walls in hills that still curl and doze in golden light. And moments later, a glass would emerge, humble and holy. Now close your eyes. It's all right, I'll keep narrating. And picture the wine window by candlelight. Soft flickers play across the stone, and the wine, a deep garnet hue, reflects them like a dreaming ruby. Someone hums an aria in the background, slightly off-key, but heartfelt. A cat pads by, unimpressed, trailing the scent of lunch leftovers. Peace, in the form of fermented grapes, is achieved. But wine windows were not just about elegance. They were evidence. Evidence that humanity, when faced with pestilence, taxes, and unruly bar tabs, can still choose innovation over madness. Rather than gathering in overcrowded taverns where revelry muddled with illness, the people invented a civilized compromise. Take your drink from a stone mouth and wander off quietly into the dusk. It may flatter your imagination, as it rightly should, to learn that the Medici family, those masters of political subtlety, patronage, and large capes, are suspected to have encouraged these contraptions. After all, when one's enemies are numerous and one's thirst is dependable, discretion becomes its own form of diplomacy. By the 18th century, wine windows were as ordinary as doorknobs, though infinitely cheerier. In time, they fell out of use, then came back during pandemics, because history, like sleep, tends to repeat itself in soft, rhythmic loops. Some claim the wine tastes better because of the ritual. Others, perhaps those who watch the hand re-emerge for payment prematurely, beg to differ. Still, in the gentle watercolor of Florentine evenings, with church bells rolling like rounded marbles down the rooftops and music sliding from balconies into the hush below, one could do worse than receive a glass of wine through a centuries-old stone frame, designed specifically for that purpose and perhaps even more for that feeling. And if you've ever wondered how many secrets pass through stone, that slowest and most patient of witnesses, it's kindly to consider that these windows have heard more sighs, songs, and questionable toasts than any diary ever could. So rest now as we leave the wine windows to their slumber, wine-scented and ghost-whispered in the cool night air. Ahead lies something even more curious, a traveller's guide to quiet taverns and the art of drinking without ever leaving your horse. Whisper it now. It's nearly time. Chapter 17. The Gentle Art of Public House Philosophy. By the flickering glow of lanterns and candle stubs, and the low hum of pipe smoke curling like a cat around ceiling beams, there existed, in the 18th century, a sacred space of community, idleness, and just enough alcohol to render everyone a moderate philosopher, the public house. Yes, the pub. Not merely a place of drinking, but a sort of health spa for the soul, where yeomen, servants, poets, and occasionally someone who claimed to have met Isaac Newton's cousin, gathered shoulder to shoulder in mutual muddle-headedness. Now imagine it, a creaky wooden interior polished not by varnish, but by 3 generations of elbows, stone floors scattered with straw or sawdust, depending on the establishment's ambitions, wooden benches distinctly designed for neither length nor comfort, but oh, the warmth, the company. The ale served in pewter mugs so dented they looked like they'd been through battle, which in fairness, some of them had. But why, you may yawningly ask, were such places so beloved? Well, dear dreamer, because the 18th century pub wasn't just a drinkery. Oh no, it was a theatre, a parliament, sometimes a courtroom, and always a kind of university, where every voice had a chance, especially after 3 pints. The public house was where news was shared, songs were born, and someone inevitably fell off a stool, citing the works of Milton. Before newspapers were quite trustworthy or regular, and long before social media could keep you informed and insomniac, your best bet for updates on wars, weather, and what was growing suspiciously in Mrs. Farnsworth's allotment was to spend an hour or 3 at the pub. Drinks were cheap because everything else was expensive. Ale and small beer were often safer than water, cheaper than imported tea, and permitted without raising suspicion from anyone but your most pessimistic cousin. Some patrons drank small beer, a weak, watered-down brew that couldn't intoxicate unless you drank it by the barrel, and some tried. Others nursed ciders, porters, and in the slightly wealthier corners of society, fortified wines brought from Portugal with all the subtlety of a cannon blast. The alehouse keeper, often a savvy widow or a semi-retired sailor with a mysterious limp, served as host and moderator. They knew the great secrets of when to refill a mug and when to quietly confiscate someone's shoes to keep them from walking home with them upside down. The truly wise barkeep could prevent a duel with a crusty loaf and a withering stare. But it wasn't all merriment. Oh no, it was mostly merriment. But even in their bleary moments, pub-goers were known to wax wise. For example, one could, after 3 ales and a plate of questionable eel pie, be heard wondering, why does gravity pull me down, but not my debt? Or, if God put hops in the field and yeast in the air, is beer not nature's sermon? To which a nearby cobbler might reply, only if sermons cause hangovers. Darts were thrown, jokes were swapped, some older than the furniture, and tales of impossible feats were told, usually involving one's uncle, a Frenchman, and an exceptionally stubborn pig. And while some pubs had names that told you exactly what to expect, like the Crown and Anchor, or the Soldier's Rest, others were wholesome mysteries like the Goose that Sang Hymns, or the Peasant's Elbow. One truly charming establishment in Norfolk, for reasons lost entirely to time, was simply called the Occasionally Wet Boot. Even the architecture conspired to relax the populace into soft inebriation. Low ceilings to muffle off-key singing, hearths warm enough to make even the grumpiest farmer hum, and large tables where no one sat alone, because frankly, most people couldn't afford enough drinks to justify a whole table. And amid this flickering, toasty world, ideas were shared, friendships fermented, and the subtle influence of moderate drink smoothed the rough edges of daily toil. So tonight, as you drift slowly into your own quiet corner of slumber, imagine yourself nestled inside one of those cheerful dens, rain tapping gently on leaded glass windows, a sleepy dog curled under the table, the comforting din of voices slightly too poetic for sobriety. As your eyes grow heavier than a half-filled tankard, remember, The soft haze of ale wasn't simply madness or indulgence. It was resilience. But over in a quieter part of town, something strange was bubbling. Not in a keg, but in a small copper still hidden behind an herbalist shop. And that's where we'll quietly tiptoe next. Chapter 18. The brandy before battle, soldiers, spirits, and sabres. Close your eyes and settle in. Let the blankets be your battlements, the pillows your peaceful stronghold. Tonight, we wander softly through the 18th century military camp, where the marching drums thudded like a drowsy heartbeat, and soldiers kept warm not just with coats, but with copious quantities of fermented fortitude. Life as an 18th century soldier was, in short, unpleasant. Your feet were perpetually blistered, your tent smelled more like unwashed wool than victory, and the food was mostly hardtack, essentially a cracker that doubled as a weapon in emergencies. But the daily dram of liquor, now that was the silver lining in your soldier's sock drawer. You see, alcohol wasn't just a leisure time luxury for the armed forces, it was strategy. Militarily mandated morale, if you will. The British Army, ever the organised lot, gave soldiers a daily ration of rum, sometimes beer, depending on what colony you had the misfortune of being stationed in. The logic was easy to understand. Drunk soldiers might not march straighter, but they certainly complained less. And in an age before standardized plumbing, antibiotics, or daytime television, a robust slug of spirits was the only buffer between frostbite and mutiny. French troops, refined as they were, enjoyed their wine with a level of sophistication only slightly diminished by battlefield cannon smoke. Even the Prussians, who famously believed in discipline so rigid it could split atoms, allowed their troop schnapps to brace against the existential horror of being stationed anywhere particularly Prussian. One charming and borderline slapstick example can be found in the prelude to the 1745 Battle of Fontenoy. French officers routinely toasted with cognac as though the upcoming battle were a particularly intense dinner party. When British and French officers unexpectedly found themselves face to face in a moment of battlefield courtesy, yes, that was a thing. The French invited their enemies to fire the first shot, possibly because their glasses were still full. Ah, etiquette. And let's not forget the naval officers. Sailors, as we explored earlier aboard slower, slightly swaying vessels, were not so much fueled as entirely constructed of rum. Before battles at sea, captains would dole out extra servings, partly to steady nerves and partly because it was terribly difficult to swing a cutlass when you're also dry and sober. The infamous Royal Navy practice of splicing the main brace was essentially a poetic way of saying, something stressful has happened. Let's all do a shot. Celebrations, punishments, and acts of record-breaking rope repair were all greeted with rum in gleeful measure. Even in the shadowed corners of continental Europe, where war and wine waltzed in elegant misery, commanders recognized the role of alcohol as both medicine and motivational speaker. Military doctors, before the professionalization of medicine and the invention of hand washing, believed alcohol could ward off disease, dull pain, and cleanse wounds, which, to be fair, it sometimes managed, but more often it made soldiers sleep through injuries that would later become the subject of retired regimental anecdotes. But as with all things sipped too soon and too often, there were consequences. Battles lost not because of enemy strategy, but because someone shouted charge, and half the battalion thought they meant bar tab. Among the more cautious commanders, a quiet debate flourished. Should armies be brave and tipsy, or brave and coordinated? Alas, many erred on the side of tipsy. Let your mind meander now to an image of red-coated infantrymen, glinting in candlelit tents, nursing pewter cups of warm spirits, trading stories of past skirmishes and future impossibilities. Outside, freezing winds gust across damp fields, but inside the canvas walls, the laughter flows more freely than tactical wisdom. Here, in these fleeting fire-lit bubbles of time, the 18th century soldier found a kind of peace. It came not from victory or politics or even dry socks, but from the warmth of a drink shared with comrades, under stars blurred into abstraction by both intoxication and exhaustion. And as our chapter folds into sleep, we drift closer to another curious corner of this gently sloshed century, where fermentation went from field to fashion. Chapter 19. The Alewife's Whisper and the Wooden Tankard. If you listen closely in the quiet hours before sleep, you might just hear it. The gentle clink of a wooden tankard, its contents sloshing lazily as the alewife hums an old ballad from the back room. In the 18th century, that humble clatter was the sound of life itself. It echoed through villages, filled city taverns, and washed softly against the edges of daily hardship like a kind tide. Tonight, we curl up inside the life of the alewife, one of the most overlooked, overworked, and slightly fermented figures in the annals of British and colonial history. Now, don't let the name fool you. The alewife was not a fish, though confusingly, that is also a fish. She was the brewer, seller, and sometimes the philosopher sage of her tavern or cottage. Long before brewing became an industrial boys' club, women were the original masters of malt, and in the 18th century, their beverages weren't served for fun alone. They were as essential as bread, perhaps more so, especially when the water could be as dangerous as a duel at dawn. You see, the water of yesteryear was frequently, let's say, enthusiastic in its microbial activity. In London, it gurgled past slaughterhouses and through sewer ditches with the careless freedom of a toddler with finger paints. One didn't drink from the Thames unless one was exceptionally brave or deeply confused. This is where our soft-spoken protagonist, the alewife, steps in with her brew, lightly fermented, gently tangy, and only mildly intoxicating. Like a beer that sang you lullabies instead of shanties, it was known as small beer, and it was virtually everywhere. Children drank it, farmhands drank it, people drank it for breakfast, with dinner, after chores, and often during the sermon, ostensibly to keep awake, but often to survive an extra long homily. Making small beer was an act of everyday alchemy. The alewife would steep malted barley with water, stir gently with a long wooden paddle, passing down the same rhythm as her mother had taught her. Then came the boiling, the straining, and the careful cooling. Because even in the most relaxed fermentation, science is always a little impatient. A bit of yeast, a day or two of bubbling burps, and then magic. A pale, cloudy beer that kept thirst at bay and disease at arm's length. It wasn't glamorous work. Alewives rarely dazzled on the social ladder. If anything, they lived underneath it, trying to avoid the occasional falling foot. But they were indispensable. History tends to shine its light on generals and kings, those rather impatient men who gallop across the stage. But the alewife, she was the steady warmth behind the curtain, handing you a mug when your trench foot throbbed, or when your ox refused to plough straight. And naturally, there were tales. Stories of alewives selling potion-like pints with bewitching effects. She might be accused of adding herbs with mysterious Latin names. A bit of mugwort to make you dream about choir boys. Maybe some henbane to light up your thoughts slightly too brightly. these suspicions sometimes turned darker, so much so that in parts of Europe, to be a woman making strong beer alone was nearly synonymous with being a witch. The brewing cow, the bubbling cauldron, the black cat, probably just waiting for a scrap of boiled barley, all perfectly innocent, but treacherously theatrical. Still, despite the whisperings and witch huntings, the alewives' tap never really ran dry. She persisted in petticoats and practicality, pouring comfort into every tankard. And even though the Industrial Revolution would eventually puff its smoky lungs and sweep beer-making into the realm of machines and monocles, there would always be that faint memory of the woman with a wide grin and flour-dusted hands, humming tunes while tending copper pots. Can you picture it? A dimly lit cottage filled with the warm scent of grain and yeast, a cat curled atop a spent sack of malt, and the alewife moving slowly between firelight and shadow. Not a queen, not a knight, just the quiet heartbeat of a thirsty world. And as night deepens, let us wander from her wooden door, walking softly along the cobbled lane, where laughter murmurs behind shutters and barrels rest like sleepy puppies outside cellar doors. Because our next stop, well, it involves something with bubbles, glass, and a rather fashionable addiction to elegance. Chapter 20. The Curious Case of Tea with a Side of Gin. Let us tiptoe now into a part of the 18th century that may surprise your sleepy mind. A tale of dainty teacups and clinking gin bottles, of lace doilies and gently blurred vision. Tonight, we're slipping into the creaking door of a London parlour. 1 part drawing room, 1 part spirited apothecary. In 18th century Britain, tea was steeping its way into polite society, sipped delicately by fashionable ladies who discussed poetry, embroidery, and which cousin had most recently eloped disgracefully, but hidden in plain sight amidst all the saucers and scones was gin. Ah yes, gin, the ruiner of reputations, the firewater of the footman, the sip that brought both solace and scandal. It was the beverage of choice for many who couldn't afford the finer drinks, and even for some who could, but preferred a little recklessness with their refreshment. You see, by the 1730s, Britain was in the grip of a gin craze so intense that it made today's coffee addiction look like a herbal tea fast. There were over 7,000 gin shops in London alone. That's one for roughly every 600 people. Gin was cheaper than beer, and on days when the Thames smelled particularly adventurous, it was a safer bet than water. A particularly reassuring brand of gin was affectionately called Lady's Delight because it promised a smoother taste, and entirely coincidentally, a reduced sense of dignity. Recipes varied wildly. Some were made with exotic botanicals, others with ingredients that could also be used to embalm a goat. Either way, gin was everywhere, and in everything, even tea. Now, it wasn't exactly ladylike to slug spirits from a flask before lunch, but when your tea was mysteriously fragrant and had just a little bite, well, who's to say what truly steeped in the pot? Some hosted what were known, quite charmingly, as tea gins. These were social gatherings where tea was served with a whisper of gin for warmth, giggles, and unspoken rebellion. A toast to propriety. From behind the mask of propriety, even clergymen weren't immune. There was the slightly bemused Reverend Wimbles of Essex, who once delivered an entire sermon on the moral dangers of gin, while quietly sipping some from his hip pocket, strictly medicinal, of course. The Lord surely appreciates a warm belly on a cold Sunday, he was heard to mumble. But it wasn't all parlour, games and tipsy vicars. At its worst, the gin craze led to real, tangible trouble. The government, soon seeing the population blinking at the moon mid-morning, stepped in with the Gin Act of 1736. This law intended to make distilling gin expensive and difficult. Fully 8 years after society began to suspect something was going on, when toddlers knew more about juniper berries than the alphabet. In response, the gin drinkers of London did what any resourceful people might. They made bathtub gin. Really. Gin brewed in actual bathtubs, usually while the bather was still in it, giving a whole new meaning to soaking in spirits. The government responded in turn with more laws, more fines, and eventually a level of regulation that cooled the gin fever, slightly. Still, gin had already left its botanical fingerprints across British culture. It became an emblem of everything from working-class bravado to aristocratic affectation. And lo, the great paradox was born. A nation of tea drinkers who may or may not also be quietly soused by mid-afternoon. This curious cohabitation of herbal sobriety and distilled daring created a rather fascinating social dance. You never quite knew what lurked inside the teapot at your aunt's house. Green tea, Ceylon blend, or perhaps something with just a touch of juniper and regrettable decisions. As candlelight flickered across wigged heads and geranium-patterned wallpapers, this balance of appearances and inhibited giggles carried on behind closed doors. Guests left with pink cheeks, loose bonnets, and slightly skewed stories of a very agreeable visit. Somewhere between the swirl of a teaspoon and the swish of silk skirts, Britain quietly invented the alcohol-infused tea party. And in doing so, it reminded us that history, much like tea, is best enjoyed warm, steeped in stories, and occasionally spiked. And with that, let your thoughts drift with the vapor of a forgotten teacup toward the glimmering lamplight of the evening streets, where society's mischief sometimes masqueraded as manners. We'll soon wander into another room of this slightly inebriated century, where fashion gets tight, wigs get taller, and modesty runs into creative engineering. Chapter 21. The Teacup Rebellion and Other Hot Water Crimes. By now, dear dreamer, you are floating gently above the 18th century like a particularly drowsy weather balloon. Below you, chimneys puff, wigs wobble, and taverns glow with candlelight, their walls murmuring secrets fermented in oak barrels. But tonight, with the clink of teacups and a whisper of revolution, we arrive at a moment of quiet but rebellious clarity in our tale of mild inebriation. The curious rise of tea, and why, oddly enough, it was once more scandalous to sip than to swig. For many centuries, the fine people of Britain and her colonies had looked at water and said, "No thank you, I value my insides." Beer, small ale, cider, and even wine were the beverages of choice, not necessarily because they were festive, but because they were marginally safer than whatever horrors lay lurking in the village well. Then, swirling in from the east, arrived something new, hot, soothing, dignified, and just a little bit magical. Tea. Leafy, mysterious, and very expensive, it promised not only hydration without hangover, but civility in every cup. Imported through the British East India Company, one of history's more monocled monopolies, tea was sold, taxed, resold, retaxed, stolen, smuggled, and occasionally accidentally drunk with one's pinky raised. For the well-heeled English household, drinking tea was more than hydration. It was performance art. Porcelain cups delicately clinked. Sugar was stirred with such poise it might induce fainting, and biscuit bowls watched proudly from the sidelines. But for the vast majority of people, those without powdered wigs and drawing rooms decorated by someone named Clarence the Upholsterer. Tea was either too costly or too heavily taxed to be a daily indulgence. Until, of course, it wasn't. Smuggling. The damp, moonlit art of getting what one legally shouldn't. In the 18th century, the dark waves around the British coast were busy with little skiffs moving after sunset, carrying not stolen jewels nor secret messages, but chests of contraband tea. It was lighter than alcohol, easier to hide in your socks, and could brew up to 5 pots before it gave up the ghost. In fact, by the 1780s, some historians estimate that 2/3 of all tea in Britain was smuggled. It was against this very steep backdrop that one of history's pettiest tea-related squabbles curled into revolution. Across the sea in the American colonies, the British government, still nursing its post-war debts and perhaps slightly tipsy on power, decided the Americans ought to pay heavy taxes on their imports, tea very much included. The colonists sniffed the air, deemed it rather unfair, and expressed their discontent in the most British way they could, dramatically throwing things into a harbour while dressed in someone else's outfit. Thus was steeped the Boston Tea Party. The year was 1773. The night was crisp, the tension was high, and the disguise of Mohawk Indians was historically questionable at best. A group of colonial patriots who were either deeply committed to liberty or just didn't like overpriced drinks boarded the British ships and hurled 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbour. That's more than 90,000 pounds of leaves, enough for over 18 million cups gone to the briny depths. Somewhere, a fish briefly enjoyed a very refined morning. Now, while the British Empire was still dabbing its powdered nose with indignation, Americans began drinking more coffee, partly out of self-righteousness, partly out of rebellion, and possibly just to stay awake during all those long meetings about democracy. This caffeine-fueled switch gave America its taste for the coffee bean, and Britain, oddly enough, responded not by ending taxes, but by doubling down on smuggling enforcement and inventing even ruder nicknames for colonists. Meanwhile, teapots kept whistling across the land. Some sipped in defiance, some in ceremony, and many simply because the taste of slightly burnt hops had worn out its welcome. But make no mistake, in the world before modern plumbing and chilled Perrier, tea and its rebellious cousin, coffee, were safer than water, cheaper than whiskey, and far less likely to leave you serenading cows at 2 a.m. So as the century steeped on, another transformation bubbled beneath the surface. People no longer needed to be slightly drunk just to survive the day's thirst. Instead, they might be slightly caffeinated and delightfully opinionated. It was the beginning of less tipsy hydration and far more agitated liberty. Wrap your thoughts like warm hands around a porcelain cup, dear listener. For in the next chapter, we part the butterslick sails and follow the noble mariners who navigated both oceans and open taverns, sometimes simultaneously. Chapter 22. The Secret Society of Teacups and Tipples. Let us drift now into the hush of parlour rooms and the clink of porcelain, the kind of places where debates about empire were held in dressing gowns, and revolution whispered itself into being over softly steaming drinks. By the late 1700s, a strange and rather delightful irony began to brew in the kettles of fashionable Europe. For the first time in centuries, people started voluntarily putting down their mugs of ale to lift daintier cups filled with something rather foreign, immensely prized, and just slightly scandalous: tea. And while the 18th century was still fogged with beer breath and musky tavern chatter, in certain corners of society, a different potion was rising to power, less punchy but more potent in politics. Tea had arrived, and it brought with it the most ruffled and perfumed form of rebellion imaginable. But don't imagine this was a calm surrender to sobriety. Oh no. The shift was full of drama, steeped in smuggling, taxation, and afternoons filled with powdered wigs whispering over tea cakes. You see, the British, clever daydreamers that they were, had fallen head over slippers for Chinese tea. At first, it was medicinal, something you sipped when your humours were misbehaving or your spleen felt especially Victorian. But soon it became fashionable, and then fashionable became profitable. And then, well, like anything the British Empire loved, they tried to tax it. Taxing the tea was less about hot beverages and more about money and control, and the sort of imperial logic that said, if we're going to drink it, we might as well make money off it. A lot of money. Here lies the twisty bit. While the upper crust sat in chairs that looked more like pastries than furniture, gently pouring their Darjeeling into porcelain cups thin as lace, vast networks of people, poor, desperate, or simply entrepreneurial, began smuggling tea into Britain to avoid those hefty duties. It was, hilariously, often the same tea, just less official. A brisk journey in a Dutch ship here, a wool sack filled with leaves there, and suddenly you had what was known as the finest contraband this side of breakfast. Entire coastal communities became experts at hiding tea in bedposts, barrels, and once, quite memorably, a funeral casket. Nothing hides taxation like sorrow, apparently. And while this leafy liquid seemed like a march towards sobriety, those clever 18th century minds didn't quite give up their love of a buzz. Oh no, they simply found ways to hybridize. Thus entered the lovely, perplexing world of tea punches. Take tea, add sugar, a generous wedge of lemon, and then, quite necessarily, a slosh, or two, or several, of brandy or rum. Stir until your cheeks feel flushed with global trade. Tea punches were, for a time, the glamorous centres of social swirl. They were ladled out of bowls large enough to bathe in, often carved from sorcerous quantities of crystal or silver, and they gurgled like gossip whenever someone was married, promoted, or survived a duel without being terribly wounded. In truth, tea let the fashionable feel better about their drinking habits. It had the temperament of sobriety, warm, gentle, vaguely medicinal, but could be laced with spirit as needed. The result was something like a reliquary of virtue. Half tea temple, half torrid tavern. Meanwhile, in quieter drawing rooms across Europe, the ceremony of tea became synonymous with elegance. The act of pouring was delicate, the saucers divine. The teaspoons curled like the ends of a cat's tail after a long nap. People constructed entire social scripts around a second steep. And yet, beneath the velvet gloves and gilded sugar tongs, it was all still about the same thing. Sipping something that made the day feel softer, the headaches less sharp, and the conversations more absurdly philosophical. Because whether it was beer at breakfast, gin in the alleyway, or brandy spiked tea in the conservatory, the 18th century was above all else looking for an easier way to be human in corsets and powdered wigs. The tea may have come from China, the punch bowl may have come from the silversmith, but the sigh that followed, that long, relieved exhale after the first sip, that was entirely universal. Now, let's gently place the teacup down, not with a clatter, mind you, but with the kind of quiet dignity reserved for dreams on porcelain saucers. And as the final curls of steam drift upward, we drift too, toward a story where coffee dares to make its entrance. Chapter 23. the gentle art of tipsy diplomacy. Picture it now, a dimly lit salon, candles fluttering nervously in their sconces, a walnut table groaning beneath the weight of silver goblets and half-eaten sturgeon. All around, powdered wigs nod solemnly, monocles fog with the steam of conversation. And somewhere in the corner, somebody is playing a sonata, despite quite obviously being 2 wines deep. Yes, dear dreamer, we are entering the sublime and sleep-inducing world of tipsy diplomacy. The curious business of running entire nations while ever so slightly squiffy. In the 18th century, the line between politics and parties was, well, mostly blurred by Madeira. It was a golden time when international relations were often handled over long, drawn-out banquets in which the wine flowed faster than coherent policy. You see, alcohol was not merely a social lubricant, it was woven tightly into the business of governance. After all, one could not be expected to shape the fate of empires on dry lips and empty goblets. Formal meetings between diplomats almost always involved a lavish display of drink, as if volume of port implied power, and 3 rounds of brandy were necessary to interpret treaties over 4 hours of increasingly passionate gesturing. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the stately courts of Europe. In Vienna, emissaries to the Habsburg court were introduced to the imperial toasting protocol, an unofficial yet ironclad tradition that required new diplomats to outtoast their predecessors. The record, we are told, was once held by an intrepid ambassador from Poland who matched the emperor goblet for goblet through a 6-hour dinner and reportedly had to be helped home via a decorative cannon. And, remarkably, the diplomacy somehow worked. In the British Parliament, matters weren't entirely different. MPs were rumoured to keep flasks in their waistcoats and brandy beneath the benches. It was said that a member of Parliament who remained sober past 3 p.m. was either deeply unwell or very new. The infamous Pitt the Younger, for instance, was known to begin his day with a glass of port and strictly end it only when the bottle did. Though he bore the face of a severely sober statesman, Pitt reportedly once delivered a rousing and entirely incomprehensible budget speech while mildly soused, a tradition still practiced by modern economics, albeit metaphorically. But politics wasn't the only arena where liquor twinkled behind power. The practice of wet negotiations, so-called, not because they took place in the rain, but because most participants were already several goblets deep, saw the signing of peace treaties, declarations of war, and international alliances all inked with hands just steady enough to be legible. Consider the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, a complicated multi-nation agreement attempting to stitch together peace after the War of Austrian Succession. Delegates from across Europe gathered in the Low Countries, where the Dutch hosted, primarily because their cellars were superlative and their tolerance even better. While the treaty itself was a tangled mess of cloudy compromises, everyone left amicable, if not a little hungover. Meanwhile, in France's glorious salons, where Enlightenment thinkers and nobility scudded around chandeliers like perfumed clouds, philosophical intoxication was considered quite chic. Voltaire was known to enjoy a daily glass of champagne, which he called liquid sparkle for intellectual combustion. Rousseau preferred red wine, preferably aged and brooding, like his political theories. One story claims that Rousseau, encouraged by a particularly robust Bordeaux, once tried to debate a chair for its imperialist overtones. Even the American founding fathers, a notoriously thirsty bunch, believed that sharing a bottle was next to sharing values. Benjamin Franklin, ever the wag, once remarked that wine makes daily living easier, less hurried, with fewer tensions and more tolerance. He conveniently left out it also led to the Constitutional Convention's less legible notes. What this all reminds us, dear sleeper, is that for all the weighty moments in history, the treaties and trials, the policies and pronouncements, there were candle-lit rooms and tumblers full of honeyed spirits, that for every grand declaration, there was likely an under-table toast, and that perhaps, under the mellowing haze of tipple, history's players found a way to be just a little more human. Or, at the very least, just coherent enough for signatures. Let your head drift now, heavy as a diplomat after dessert wine, floating gently into the next scene. For in the quiet hours, another secret of the slightly drunk 18th century stirs, waiting patiently in the shadows of time. Chapter 24. A toast to moonlight and Malmsey. And now we meander to the end, not with a bang, nor a hangover, but with a lull. Let the fire crackle low in your imagination. The candle is a stub, flickering valiantly against the descending hush of midnight. The pewter mug is half full, or perhaps half asleep. And as we slip past the final pages of this tipsy tale, remember, in the 18th century, the clink of tankards was as ordinary a sound as birdsong at dawn. In a world before sparkling water came in matte aluminum cans with ironic fruit names, the drink of choice was, well, anything with bubbles and a whisper of fermentation, or just anything wet. From town criers to turbaned philosophers, everyone seemed just a wee bit jolly, which is a polite way of saying somewhat soused. Even breakfast was less bacon and eggs, more biscuits and beer. They called it small beer, which sounds like something you'd serve an elf, but was in fact a low-alcohol everyday drink, safer than the murky water of the town pump, which was often generously seasoned with medieval cholera and Victorian optimism. Workers had beer breaks, which makes modern coffee culture feel positively Puritan. In the countryside, alewives brewed hearty brown ales in kitchens smoky with wood fire and gossip. In cities, young apprentices might receive part of their weekly wage in gin, conveniently streamlining the work inebriation balance. And sailors, bless their watery souls. The British Navy rationed a half pint of rum per man every single day, which might explain why their maps occasionally featured sea monsters playing backgammon. But not all drink was equal. The aristocracy sipped Madeira under painted ceilings, toasting Handel and hiccuping through poetry. In salons dressed in gilded futility, brandy sloshed in cut crystal while powdered wigs tilted slightly off kilter, not from fashion, but from the mild effects of pre-dinner port. Even medicine got tipsy. Laudanum, that charming cocktail of opium and alcohol, was the go-to for everything from insomnia to heartache to, surprisingly, suspicious mothers-in-law. Doctors gleefully prescribed brandy for digestion, sherry for nerves, and gin for inclement weather, or just weather in general. Yet, amid this mirthful murkiness, there was a quiet kind of wisdom sewn into their habits. For in those simpler, more porous times, when clocks ticked slower and hygiene was more of a suggestion than a practice, a mild buzz may have been the best survival strategy. Wine kept the wolves of doubt at bay, beer bubbled up camaraderie, and gin, well, gin gave courage to the city's invisible millions. Of course, moderation was not always part of the script. The gin craze in 18th century London turned entire alleyways into impromptu taprooms. Hogarth's sketches warned of Gin Lane, where morality floated away in a juniper-scented fog. But reform eventually tamed the tides, and by the century's end, the British were once again respectably intoxicated, mainly in parlours and only on Tuesdays, probably. And so, with the gentle flutter of years carved into weathered oak beams and the sigh of a tavern door swinging shut, we find ourselves at the edge of history's dreamscape. The 18th century was not a carousel of drunken frivolity. No, more a slow, sleepy waltz with tipple in hand. A world where the wine was often warmer than the fireplace and where good cheer came in bottles sealed with waxy optimism. Let us lift one last imaginary tankard, not in wild revel, but in a whisper, to the barley fields and the busy brew houses, to the water that wasn't quite water and the people who weren't quite sober, to the poets who rhymed better after 2 glasses, and to the farmers who believed hops made the cows happier. May your night be as gentle as warm ale in winter, and your dreams as silly and soothing as a somnambulist shepherd sipping cider in a sock hat. Good night, fellow time traveller. Sleep well, dream odd, and may your spirits, of both the historic and fermented kind, always be pleasantly aged.